Have you ever met someone who seemed mature way too early? The kid who never caused problems, the one adults described as responsible, wise beyond their years, so easy to deal with. While other children were making mistakes, getting into trouble, and asking for help, this person was already acting like a miniature adult. People usually see that as a compliment, but psychology tells a more complicated story, because sometimes growing up too fast isn't a sign of maturity. It's a sign that childhood ended before it was supposed to. Here's the thing. Children aren't naturally responsible for everyone else's emotions. They're not supposed to be the family therapist, the peacemaker, the problem solver, or the emotional support system. Yet some children quietly become exactly that. Maybe there was constant conflict at home. Maybe a parent was emotionally unavailable. Maybe there was stress, instability, illness, addiction, financial pressure, or simply too much responsibility placed on young shoulders. Whatever the cause, the child learns something important very early. Nobody is coming to handle this, so they do. Psychologists often refer to this process as parentification. It's when a child begins taking on emotional or practical responsibilities that normally belong to adults. Sometimes it's obvious: cooking meals, taking care of younger siblings, managing household tasks. But emotional parentification can be much harder to spot. That's the child who listens to their parents' problems, the child who mediates arguments, the child who constantly monitors everyone's mood, the child who feels responsible for keeping the family stable. And because they're praised for being mature, nobody notices the cost. The outside world sees capability. The child experiences pressure. What's fascinating is how quickly the brain adapts. Children are remarkably flexible. If responsibility becomes necessary for survival, the brain starts prioritizing responsibility over exploration. Over time, play feels less important. Curiosity becomes secondary. Being careful becomes the priority. Making mistakes feels dangerous. Psychologists describe childhood as a period where the brain learns through experimentation. You try things, you fail, you recover, you learn. But children who grow up too fast often skip part of that process. They're too busy managing consequences before they happen. You can still see this pattern in adulthood. They're often the people who think 10 steps ahead, the planners, the fixers, the ones who always have a backup plan, the ones everyone depends on. At first glance, that sounds like a strength, and in many ways it is. But strengths developed through necessity often come with hidden costs. One of those costs is hypervigilance. Imagine spending years scanning the environment for problems, watching people's moods, looking for signs of conflict, trying to predict what might go wrong. Eventually, your brain gets very good at it. The problem is that it doesn't always turn off. Even when life becomes safer, the mind continues searching for threats. Research shows that people exposed to chronic stress during childhood often develop heightened sensitivity to environmental changes. They notice small shifts that others miss: a different tone of voice, a delayed text message, a subtle facial expression. Their brain learned that small signals matter because once upon a time they did. Another interesting pattern appears in relationships. People who grew up too fast often struggle to receive care. Giving support feels natural. Receiving it feels uncomfortable. If you've spent your entire life being the strong one, allowing someone else to help can feel strangely vulnerable. Sometimes they don't even realize they're doing it. Someone offers assistance, they decline. Someone asks what they need, they say they're fine. Someone tries to support them emotionally, they change the subject. Not because they don't want connection, because independence became part of their identity. Depending on others feels unfamiliar, and unfamiliar things often feel unsafe. There's another paradox hiding underneath all of this. Many people who grew up too fast appear extremely competent, but deep down, they often carry a persistent fear of failure. That seems contradictory. How can someone be capable and insecure at the same time? The answer lies in how they learn to measure their worth. When children receive primarily attention for being helpful, responsible, or mature, they may begin believing that love must be earned, not through who they are, through what they provide. Their value becomes tied to performance, to usefulness, to reliability, and that creates enormous pressure. Because if your worth depends on being dependable, mistakes become more than mistakes. They become threats to your identity. This is one reason many highly responsible adults struggle with perfectionism. Perfectionism isn't always about high standards. Sometimes it's about protection. If everything is perfect, nobody gets upset, nobody criticizes you, nobody gets disappointed. At least, that's what the nervous system learns to believe. But perfection is an impossible target, and chasing impossible targets is exhausting. Here's something people rarely talk about. Many adults who grew up too fast don't actually know how tired they are. Responsibility became normal so early that carrying emotional weight feels natural. They've been doing it for so long, they barely notice it anymore. It's like carrying a heavy backpack every day for years. Eventually, you stop feeling the weight, not because it's gone, because you've adapted to it. And adaptation can be deceptive. You look functional, productive, reliable. Meanwhile, your nervous system is operating under constant strain. This helps explain why burnout often surprises these individuals. They don't see it coming. They've always handled everything. They've always pushed through. They've always been the dependable one. Until one day, they can't. And that moment feels deeply confusing because their entire identity was built around being capable. But capability has limits. Every human being has limits. Another consequence of growing up too fast is difficulty accessing emotions. Not necessarily because emotions disappear, because emotions were inconvenient. Think about it. If a child is focused on managing adult problems, there isn't always room to process their own feelings. Fear gets postponed, sadness gets postponed, anger gets postponed. Everything gets postponed. The priority becomes functioning. Years later, those emotions often remain stored beneath the surface. Psychologists sometimes describe this as emotional suppression. The feelings never truly leave, they simply wait. This can create a strange experience in adulthood. A person appears calm, logical, and controlled, yet small events trigger unexpectedly intense reactions. A minor disappointment feels overwhelming. A small rejection hurts more than expected. A simple conflict becomes emotionally exhausting. The reaction isn't always about the present moment. Sometimes it's years of postponed emotions finally demanding attention. But here's what's remarkable. Many people who grew up too fast also develop extraordinary strengths: empathy, resilience, adaptability, problem-solving, emotional intelligence, the ability to stay calm during crisis. These aren't imaginary qualities, they're real. The challenge is learning to keep the strengths without carrying the burden that created them. That's where healing becomes different from what most people imagine. Healing doesn't mean becoming less responsible. It means realizing responsibility was never supposed to belong entirely to you. It means understanding that your value isn't measured by how much you carry, or how much you sacrifice, or how many problems you solve. For many people, one of the hardest lessons comes surprisingly late in life. Learning that being cared for is not weakness. Learning that asking for help is not failure. Learning that rest is not laziness. Learning that relationships are supposed to involve mutual support, not one person carrying everything alone. And perhaps most importantly, learning that you don't have to earn your right to exist through constant usefulness. Because children who grow up too fast often become adults who feel guilty whenever they're not productive, as if simply being is never enough. But it is. The truth is that growing up too fast changes people. It teaches lessons early, some valuable, some painful. It creates adults who can survive almost anything, but survival and peace are not the same thing. One keeps you functioning, the other allows you to live. And that's the realization many people reach much later than they expected. They spent years becoming the person everyone else could depend on. Then eventually, they discover something surprising. They deserve someone to depend on too. If this felt uncomfortably familiar, you're not alone. And if you want to understand another psychological pattern that quietly shapes thousands of lives, the next video might explain even more than this one.